And so we will need to clear the venue. To let you know now, I will remind you again afterwards. So you don't want to hear any more from me, so please join me in welcoming to the stage Simon Armitage and Nandini Nair.
Simon, welcome to Jaipur. I hear it's your second time, and not too sure when was your first time.
I think it was 7 years ago, but it might be 20.
It might be 20. So I'm going to jump right into this, and I think I want to just say that how privileged we are to have you here, and I know you have a very busy schedule, and you have made time to come to Jaipur to be with all of us, so thank you. What does this name mean, and how do we pronounce it?
So the title of the book is Sandettie Light Vessel Automatic. It's the name of a shipping forecast area as part of the shipping forecast in the UK. So most people who've been brought up in Britain, and perhaps even people who listen to the World Service as well, have got used to this litany of areas with quite sort of exotic sounding names which go all the way around the coast of the UK and for which the weather forecast is given. And nearly every poet that I know of has written a poem which involves or includes the shipping forecast at some level. Seamus Heaney has a poem, Carol Ann Duffy has a poem. And Sandettie Light Vessel Automatic is an unstaffed automatic lighthouse off the coast of northern France, which sends out a particular light signal to warn ships from straying onto a sandbank there. And I suppose I used it as the title for this book because it implies a kind of utility, the idea that there is a sort of work going on there, that it has a function, but also it's part of a kind of hypnotic litany of names which have their own dreamscape as well. So this just seemed to me, well, at one particular moment, to be a good title for a book of poems which were all commissions or projects of some kind.
You mentioned the word utility, and I know you've used the word trade as a verb and a noun in your own words to describe your work and to describe poetry. And I find that very interesting because so often to us readers, poetry is seen as something about the inspiration and the muse which a poet has access to. But you've sort of made it more functional in a way. So can we talk about that?
Well, I think it's probably worth saying that, I don't own the definition of the word poetry. If you ask 100 poets what poetry means, you will get 100 different answers. It's a very broad church, and there's no specific value to that word other than what people choose to give it. My own relationship with poetry has been one of trade and craft. And yeah, as you say, when I use those phrases in the introduction, I mean them in both ways. That I've thought of something. I've thought of poetry as a kind of trade in the sense that it's made. It is a crafted thing, but also it's something which I have made my living at and with. And I suppose in relation to the commissioned work and the project work, then it's a trade in the sense that I swap my skill sets for whatever else people are prepared to give me in return, a kind of barter.
That's the other interesting thing about this book, because it is collaborative, and you talk about that as well. And again, it's sort of expanding the meaning of poetry from a lone man or woman slogging over his verse or her verse to something that's a team effort nearly. Could you talk to us about that?
So when I started writing, I came across a quote from Les Murray, the Australian poet who died last year, and he talked about poetry as a go-anywhere art form. He was probably just referring to the idea that it tends to come in slim volumes that you can put in your back pocket. You know, it's fairly portable in that sense. But I took this as a comment about poetry's versatility, and that it didn't just have to exist in these things here. Books are only a relatively recent perversion of poetry. You know, poetry goes back to the campfire and the theatre and the temple, and the fact that we've come to think of it as something which primarily exists within these covers is, as I say, it's only a relatively recent idea. So I just took this idea of a go-anywhere art form as meaning that poetry had a lot of potential outside the printed page, whether that be on radio or TV or in film or on posters, just outside where you might expect to encounter it. And in fact, I think there's a strong case to be argued that poetry is at its most effective and powerful when it's least expected. We tend, most of us, on a day-to-day basis, to be preaching to the converted. So I just like the idea of trying to, maximize poetry's potential in other environments and working with other artists and learning from their vocabulary and their methodologies, and just getting opportunities to take the work out and about and get me out and about as well.
Can you, as a busking poet, you've taken poetry various places and various unexpected places. Could you illustrate that with an example, an unusual place where you felt it was effective?
Well, I never expected to be reading poetry in Jaipur. When I started writing, they were just extensions of daydreams looking out of a window in a house in West Yorkshire. And even when I gave up my proper job, which I was a probation officer in Manchester at the time, to be a full-time writer, I didn't think that I would end up reading these poems in distant locations. And in fact, in lots of ways, poetry has become a kind of passport and a sort of waiver as well. I've had experiences where I've got to immigration in various countries, and they're sort of interrogating you about what you do, and you say you're a poet. It's just too bewildering to understand, and they end up just sort of waving you through. So it's kind of like a travel pass. What was the question?
A different place where you have read poetry. You said.
Well, I walked the Pennine Way in 2010. So this is a long walk down through the north of England, through moorland and hills. And I didn't take any money with me. I made the journey as a sort of modern-day troubadour. So I walked about 15 miles a day, and then at the end of every day, I gave a reading in a church or a pub or a village hall, and sometimes in somebody's house. And they were probably the strangest readings, and some of the happiest occasions as well. It's one of the ironic truths about giving a poetry reading, I find anyway, that I'm quite happy to read in front of a huge crowd, but reading to one or two people in somebody's front room where you've had to take your shoes off is awkward. Because you have to make eye-to-eye contact, and you feel individually accountable and responsible to them. So they were probably the oddest readings, yeah.
When you did this barefoot reading with two listeners, what was their response? Do you remember?
I think they were relatively well entertained for the evening. At the end of every night, I handed a sock round, a clean one to begin with, and I invited people to put into the sock whatever they thought I was worth. That was my version of busking. And it was a slightly dangerous invitation, actually, because there were all kinds of things ended up in that sock that weren't necessarily money. And in fact, at the end of the book that I wrote about that walk, I make a long list of all the non-monetary items that have ended up in the sock, and it goes over 2.5 pages, and it finishes with these 3 items. It finishes with mint imperial, German condom, hard-boiled egg.
Oh, wow. I think let's do a reading now. And even if we don't pass the sock around, maybe we can.
Okay. I brought some slides to... Is this working?
They said point anywhere,
right? You know what? I'll just read this poem, since that's the slide that's come up. So this was a more sort of stationary project. I used to teach at the University of Sheffield, and like a lot of universities these days, they're very interested in collaboration and interdisciplinary work. And there's a professor of chemistry at Sheffield University called Tony Ryan, who has developed, or might even have invented, something called catalytic fabric. So this is a fabric which, when it becomes slightly warm, and because it's coated with a particular chemical compound, draws pollutant particles out of the atmosphere. I think it's nitric oxide which it draws out of the atmosphere. So we had this idea that we would make a big poster of a poem, and the poem would be about air quality, and the poster would physically enact what the poem was describing. So I think this was the second version of it. The first one blew down in a storm, and it was there for about 18 months, and it took out of the atmosphere 1.5 tons of polluting material at a very busy intersection in Sheffield. We had to apply to the council for planning permission to put this poem up there, and on 2 occasions planning permission was refused because the council said that they were worried that people were going to read the poem. It's a concern that I share with them on occasions, but I think what they meant was that they were worried that people would be distracted while they were driving. But even that I found slightly odd because, you know, the built environment, the built urban environment is just is full of signage and written material. So the poem is called In Praise of Air. I write in praise of air. I was 6 or 5 when a conjurer opened my knotted fist and I held in my palm the whole of the sky. I've carried it with me ever since. Let air be a major god, its being and touch, its breast milk always tilted to the lips. Both dragonfly and Boeing dangle in its see-through nothingness. Among the jumbled bric-a-brac I keep a padlocked treasure chest of empty space, and on days when thoughts are fuddled with smog, or civilization crosses the street with a white handkerchief over its mouth, and cars blow kisses to our lips from theirs, I turn the key, throw back the lid, breathe deep. My first word, everyone's first word, was air.
So, what do you think a poem plastered on a wall like this in a building achieves? Why is it important to take poetry to places like this?
Well, I think partly to try and accomplish what I was talking about before, which is to engage with an unsuspecting readership. I mean, in the case of that particular poem, it had a valuable scientific function, as well as what I would hope is, an artistic and an aesthetic one. But I've just always jumped at the chance to try and put poetry in places where you might not expect it. So another project that I was involved in several years ago now was called Stanza Stones. And it was a commission. So a literature festival got in touch and said, can you think of a way of putting literature and poetry physically back into the landscape? I think the idea was that I'd written a lot about the landscape, and could this relationship work in the other direction? So the first idea that I had was that we would buy a mountain and that we would slice half of it off, and then I would write a poem and we would carve that poem into the mountain, and it would be our very own poetic Mount Rushmore. And it would be so big, you'd be able to read it from the moon.
Oh, wow.
Anyway, it turned out that we didn't have the budget for that.
And it doesn't sound very eco-friendly.
And it wasn't very eco-friendly. It was just a kind of fantasy, really. And so we scaled back the ambition and the eco-credentials of the project. And eventually I wrote a sequence of 6 poems all about water in some shape or form. And these poems were carved into the rocks in the Pennine landscape. This is the landscape of, well, particularly West and South Yorkshire, where I live. And most of them were carved into exposed rocks that had already been brutalized in some way, so old quarry faces and things like that. But what I liked about the project was that the people who read those poems aren't necessarily poets or poetry lovers. They're often people out walking their dog, or they're hikers, or people who've ended up in quite a remote area of the moor and the hillside for whatever reason. And it was also interesting for the idea that whenever you make a mark in stone, I think there's some sense that it will be permanent. We use that as a phrase, it's written in stone. But even though the depth of these carvings, they estimate, mean that the poems will be in place for about 1,000 years, if you think back 1,000 years to what language was then, and they say that language is changing at an increasing rate, in 1,000 years hence, even if there's anybody around to read them, these poems will just be hieroglyphs. They will be incomprehensible.
Do you have a photo of that? Could we show a stanza stone?
We can try.
What was this?
That's the Bronte sisters again, who have nothing to do with this poem. That's the house where I was born and brought up, which equally has nothing to do with this poem. But this has plenty to do with this poem. So this is the Beck stone, and so this is one of the few natural stones that we used in the project. And as you can see, it's a kind of big, squat, sort of Buddha-shaped stone, and it sits in the middle of a stream called Backstone Beck. And above that is a big area called Ilkley Moor. And when it's rained a lot, i.e. all the time in Yorkshire, the rain comes hurtling down the valley and quite often laps against the bottom of the stone there. I think you can see that darkened area. That's where the rain usually rises to. And then sometimes when it's really been hammering it down, the water rises to such a level that it pours down the front of the poem there. So this is just outside the town of Ilkley in West Yorkshire. Shall I read this poem?
Please.
So a beck is the word that we use occasionally, meaning stream. So this is the beck stone. The other stones in the series, there was a rain stone and a dew stone and a snow stone. There was even a puddle stone. I was thinking of the puddle as a sort of runt of the water family, and I thought it shouldn't go unnoticed.
Are you reading the puddle? Or?
Beck. It is all one chase. Trace it back, the source might be nothing more than a teardrop squeezed from a curlew's eye. Then follow it down to the full-throated roar at its mouth. A dipper strolls the river, dressed for dinner in a white bib. The unbroken thread of the beck, with its nose for the sea, all flux and flecks, soft soaping a pebble for over 1,000 years, or here, after hard rain, sawing the hillside in half with its chain, or here, where water unbinds and hangs over the waterfall's face, and just for that one stretched white moment becomes lace. It was interesting to me that you mentioned, the ecological aspects of imposing a carved poem onto a rock. And we had to work with all kinds of different owners and guardians of the landscape, and to make sure that they were on board with the project. My feeling was that particularly in this area of Britain, there are a huge number of ancient prehistoric carved rocks, and people have been going up onto those hillsides for thousands of years to make symbols and signs that communicate most of the time only with stars or gods or sheep. And I just sort of wanted to be part of that dialogue, really. And then a couple of years later, another organization got in touch and said that they wanted to do something similar in an even more remote part of Britain, a place that's really valued as a as somewhere that's quite desolate on occasions. And I said that I didn't want to intrude this time with text. So I wrote a sequence of poems and recorded them. And they're triggered by GPS on your phone. So if you get within 5 meters of, as I say, these very remote locations, the poem is delivered by the miracles of science to your phone, and then you get a kind of in situ personalized reading instead of having something to read from.
Your poetry is very embedded in Yorkshire. I mean, I haven't been there, and maybe many in our audience haven't. And you have this lovely line about how you didn't want to go too far, and you were happy where you were, and the roots were important. And you've also written a poem to London saying, you stay there and I'll stay here. Can we talk a little bit about that, about home?
I only really went back to the place where I grew up out of complacency after I'd finished my degree. I didn't really have a lot of other options at the time. It was quite a cheap place to live. It was very, convenient. I knew how it worked. And then I realized over a number of years that I could not just live there, but actually I could live there as a poet. I think when I started writing, the idea was that if you had any success, or if you wanted to achieve success as a writer, you would probably have to move to London. And it's certainly true that that's where a lot of the action, by which I mean parties, are. But not long after I'd started writing, the internet came along, and I just got more and more interested in the landscape of the north of England, the vernacular, its dialects, its people, its histories. I don't see myself as a representative of that area, or a spokesperson, or somebody who wants to campaign for it. But I completely accept that my work is absolutely steeped in the culture and the atmospheres of that locality. And I think I'm quite unusual as well. I don't know many people my age who still live in the place where they grew up, especially if it's a fairly rural location.
As the current Poet Laureate, has your responsibilities changed, do you think, in some way?
Since becoming Poet Laureate?
Yes.
I think the expectations might have changed, but I don't think I've changed course. I've always been somebody as this.
So you can stay local even now.
I can still
stay local.
Yeah. I've always sort of written to occasions and about things that I see in front of me. And since I became laureate, I think I've published 7 laureate poems about various issues or ideas that have come along since then. They might be slightly more outward-facing than some of the other work, but not that much. So I think in some senses, I've just taken it in my stride and tried to bring the laureateship into my work rather than do it the other way around.
I like how once you described your own work as no brow. Could we maybe have a poem that you think...
A no-brow poem?
A no-brow poem.
No-brow is the idea that, you're neither highbrow nor lowbrow, that you're just, it'd probably make you have quite an odd-looking forehead, I suppose. So the idea would be that it doesn't really matter whether it's the Sex Pistols or Sibelius. If it's good, it's good, and that you just accept things on that basis. Okay, well, I'll read a poem which is towards the front of this book called Zodiac T-shirt. So this came about because the singer-songwriter Beck Hansen in 2013, rather than release an album, he'd published a book of sheet music. And the only way that you could listen to the songs on this album was to take the sheet music home and play the songs on your piano or your guitar. And I like that idea that it was counterintuitive, and I think it was a comment as well about the collapse of the record industry. Anyway, he gave a couple of concerts for this book, and he invited a few of us to take part, and I tried to do something that was similarly counterintuitive. So I wrote a song lyric that would never be sung. It would only ever be, well, not by me anyway, it would only ever be spoken. And that accounts for the sort of verse-chorus structure of this piece. And I suppose I would argue that this fits into that no-brow sort of aesthetic, just in the sense that, you know, I'm somebody who's never been embarrassed to talk about how influential popular music has been on my, you know, my psychology and my sensibilities.
You were in a band, or you wanted to be in a band?
I was in a band, yeah, and I'm in another band now, and but we don't need to get into that right now. So the poem's called Zodiac T-shirt, and I was trying to describe the lifespan of one of those summer relationships. Those are relationships that quite often begin after school in July in the park with cider, and then they sort of end in September in, you know, downpour and acrimony and heartache and tears. And I know it was the summer of 2013 when I wrote this, because 2013 was a really amazing summer in the UK. People started talking about it as if it were an old-fashioned summer, because in the north where I live, it had been raining for about 200 years, and we'd all been going mouldy. And then suddenly the sun came out, and everybody was outside in the park with other people, and I think that was the sort of the background to this. Zodiac T-shirt. The avenues marching with combat shorts, the pavement strutting with micro skirts, no rest from the sun, a smothering heat like a mother beast asleep on its young. Zodiac T-shirt, paperclip bracelet, Mercury rising, calling the crash team. Knock for knock and tit for tat, your bike got nicked, so you nicked one back. We pull up a tree and plant a rose, where a cigarette dies, another one grows. Zodiac T-shirt, paperclip bracelet, Mercury rising, calling the crash team. Hand in hand when the bendy bus stopped, a couple got on, a couple got off, and an ice cream wept on the steps of the church, and the crusted up reservoir died of thirst. Zodiac T-shirt, paperclip bracelet, Mercury rising, calling the crash team. Drink for drink in the park that night, me scratching yours, you scratching mine, till the words came thumping hand over fist, and the sky blew a fuse, and it started to piss on your Zodiac T-shirt, paperclip bracelet, crucifix pendant, cinnamon toothpaste, chewing gum pavement, licorice protest, dragonfly heartbeat, daisy chain necklace, candy stripe shoelace, finger bob Jesus, pregnancy dipstick, all back to your place, body bag suitcase, Mercury rising, cardiac jump leads, calling the crash team, calling the crash team, calling the crash team, calling the crash team. It doesn't really have an end in that poem. It's like I was trying to do. I wanted to do a sort of fade out, but it's not really available to you as a writer unless you get into all kinds of typographical nonsense.
So the challenge you'd set for yourself with that poem was something that's unsingable.
Unsingable for me, but I wanted it to advertise its sort of musical antecedents and maybe its musical aspirations, possibly just through its format, you know, through this verse-chorus format. If you think about a poet like W.H. Auden, who wrote a great number of lyrics, some of which were set to music and some weren't, but when you approach them, when you encounter them on the page, you can see that they have a relationship which is something more song-like necessarily than just printed poetry. I mean, my approach generally has always been that I like poems. The type of poems I like more than other poems are poems which have a voice of some kind, that sound like a written down version of speaking. I like poems that feel as if the curtains open and the poem enacts and then the curtains closed. I don't like poems that read like thinking, and I particularly don't like poems that read like writing.
So Ted Hughes is someone you like?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think all the poets that I admire at some level have what I would call a kind of living voice. One of the reasons why I got very interested in American poetry from the sort of mid-century generation, 50s, 60s, even into the 70s, was because there was just a much more relaxed vocabulary, closely connected to the speaking voice, whereas at that point in the UK, the poetic voice had got quite sort of clubby, really. You know, it often sounded like somebody leaning against a piano, reciting something, and that, you know, the living voice within a poetic framework was something that really excited me.
Can we move to the not dead? I don't think we have too much time. So that's a section, I think maybe you can tell the audience about that. Yeah.
So I work a lot with documentary filmmakers for the BBC and Channel 4 and various other platforms. And I think this is probably maybe 12 or 13 years ago now. Channel 4 asked us if we would be interested in writing a poem film about post-traumatic stress disorder. So this was at the time when there were lots of soldiers coming back from, you know, those various conflicts in the Gulf, suffering from PTSD. And I think if you go back to the First World War, at that time when British poets had a very, very intense relationship with the subjects of warfare and combat, because they were the bloggers of their day. You know, they were writing first-hand accounts of the front line and sending these poems home and undercutting the established news channels. I think if you go back to that time, this condition would probably just have had the blanket terminology of shell shock, but it's become this more specialized issue, post-traumatic stress disorder. And I've always felt this duty or this obligation to write about conflict for a couple of reasons. One, poetry has always written about war. If you go back to, you know, what is sometimes thought of as the foundation text of Western poetry, this is Homer's Iliad, it is a war poem. But more than that, you know, I've grown up in Britain in an era that is often described as peacetime. But actually, if you look closely at the UK's history since 1945, since the end of the Second World War, we have been continually in conflict with other countries and other groups ever since then. And for that reason, I wanted to engage with this subject, but I'm not a soldier, and I was puzzled about how I arrive at first-hand subject matter, and the answer came in the form of interviewing soldiers and using their statements and their accounts and their testimonies in poems. So I'll read one poem from that film. So this is a poem called The Manhunt, and it was about a soldier called Eddie who had been a peacekeeper in Bosnia. And I think because he was a peacekeeper, he hadn't been allowed to intervene in lots of the things that he'd witnessed. And he'd seen some really terrible atrocities. And I think not getting involved went against not just his training as a soldier, but some of his sort of instincts as a human being. But at some point in his military career, he'd been shot in the side of the face, and the bullet had made this extraordinary journey through his throat and his chest. And it was his wife Laura who described this journey, and when she described it, it was as if she were talking about a journey that she would have to make herself if she wanted to bring him back, because he'd become sort of lost to her. Also, when she talked about this wound, this disfigurement on the side of his face, it was as if she were talking about some very tender, intimate place, the last sort of place that he wanted anybody to touch or talk about. So the poem is called The Manhunt. And in the film, she read the poem. I thought it was important to have a woman's voice in a film about war, because even though she'd not, fought on foreign fields, she still had to, deal with conflict on a domestic front once he'd come home. The Manhunt. After the first phase, after passionate nights and intimate days, only then would he let me trace the frozen river which ran through his face. Only then would he let me explore the blown hinge of his lower jaw and handle and hold the damaged porcelain collarbone and mind and attend the fractured rudder of shoulder blade and finger and thumb the parachute silk of his punctured lung. Only then could I bind the struts and climb the rungs of his broken ribs and feel the hurt of his grazed heart. Skirting along, only then could I picture the scan, the fetus of metal beneath his chest where the bullet had finally come to rest. Then I widened the search, traced the scarring back to its source, to a sweating, unexploded mine buried deep in his mind, around which every nerve in his body had tightened and closed. Then, and only then, did I come close.
I wanted to ask you about how difficult was it to take someone's story, especially a story like this, and make it into poetry? And also, I think in the book as well, you mention how these were people who they weren't over their trauma. You probably never get over trauma like war, but it was a question of also excavating their memories and their most painful memories, which they did not want to revisit.
Well, I suppose it's, a project like this is full of anxieties. I really wanted to honor their voices and to make sure that I was responsible to their truths. These were people who, in some ways, had either lost their voice or had had their voices taken away or weren't being listened to. So I felt my job was to amplify and strengthen the things that they had to say through rendering their stories into, the intensity of poetry. Having said that, at the time when I write these poems, I try not to meet anybody. We try and do all this through video testimony or recorded statement, and the reason for that is that I need to keep some kind of distance to be able to make the poems into pieces of art. I think if I got to know people, I would become very sensitive as to their personalities and maybe get over-emotional, and then the poems would just become sort of big blobs of jelly, really. And I've said this before about writing. Yeah, I know I deal in, sometimes disturbing and emotional subjects like warfare and people's lives, real people's lives, but at the time of writing the poem, I am very cold, very dispassionate, very distanced, just because I need to keep a steady hand. So for me, writing, it's a little bit like dissecting a rat. It doesn't work if I'm in the sort of white heat of the emotion. I've got to be very withdrawn. And sometimes that means I can get, emotionally over-involved in the poems at a later date. But yeah, just need to keep a steady eye and a steady hand. So at the time of writing, I don't really feel anything at all, other than wanting to manipulate language on a page to be able to reproduce that sensation in somebody else.
So you wrote these poems long after having met them, or long after having heard their interviews?
Yeah, almost, yeah, within weeks, yeah, but 200 miles away.
Right. We have about 14 minutes left, so we can open this to audience questions. Sure.
Hello, Simon. One of the defining moments for me personally at the Jaipur Literature Festival in the last decade has been your last visit to Jaipur when you read your poem, You're Beautiful, on stage. So my question is simple. Before we end the conversation today, can you read out that poem again to this audience? There will be some old fans of yours and some new fans.
Well, it's very kind of you to ask. I'm not absolutely sure that I've got it with me, and I don't think of enough of my own poems to remember them. But I've got another event later on today, and I probably will read it then. But thank you for saying that. You know, I mentioned before that you write these poems in a kind of, you know, in the isolation booth of your own postcode, and you don't imagine that they'll travel, you know, even further than the bottom of the road. So the idea that a poem like that has found a listener and a reader here is very gratifying. Thank you.
Sorry, there's a lady in the white. Sorry, the lady and then you. Sorry. First the.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this session. I'm a college professor, and around 5 or 6 years back, we had introduced into our syllabus the poem that you wrote in 2007, I think, entitled Black Roses. And I thought that was a poem wherein the poet, that is yourself, got totally, you know, involved with it. And we in India, we are also going through the same kind of trauma, especially the Nirbhaya incident that happened in the year 2012. I was rather intrigued when you said that you were, you know, that you always kept a distance from your poem, that you were distant and clinical. I don't think so. I thought you were totally involved in Black Roses.
I think tell the audience about it.
Yeah, thank you. I think both of my readers are here today. So if I just explain to a few other people what that project was about, given that you're saying it touches on some of the things that are happening at the moment here. So a young woman called Sophie Lancaster was kicked to death in a park in Lancashire because of what she was wearing. And I first heard about this incident on the radio when the judge gave his summing up for the boys who went to prison for it, and he described it as an act of feral thuggery. And I was very moved at that time, and moved enough to get in touch with her mum and to suggest making a film, and that never got off the ground to begin with. And eventually we had the opportunity to make a radio program about it, and the radio program consisted just of two elements: an interview with her mum, and then I wrote poems in the voice of Sophie. And when we went along to interview Sylvia, the mum, I just sat behind the settee and I made notes. And it's true, obviously, that I was completely overwhelmed, you know, by the emotion of that situation. But I would still have to say that at the time of writing, all that emotion had to be cleared away. Otherwise, the page would have just been blurred with tears. And that's not going to function. You know, I had to try and set the mechanics of these poems in place, which, as I said, you know, it requires, certainly the way I approach poetry, a calm and steady hand. I know somebody who's a micro sculptor who takes beta blockers before he does his work and injects his eyebrows with some kind of chemical to stop himself blinking before he does his work. And I said to him, only half joking, oh, I do the same, meaning that I try and sort of cut off from the actual subject matter. But that particular piece had a number of different lives. It became a stage play and then became a BBC film, and we published the poems as well. And I assume that maybe you had the published version of the text, but it went on to contribute to a discussion in Britain about the police recording crimes against people of subcultures as hate crimes. So it did eventually, find a place in public discourse, and so yeah. Well, thank you for reading that. And
Hello, sir. I love your poem, sir. First of all, I have a simple question to ask. So, what do you think about poetry? Is it a skill which you kind of develop over the years, or is it something which comes within you? It's a kind of talent. I mean, which not everyone can, or is it something a skill?
yeah, it's one of the the age-old debates, isn't it? Can you make a poet? I don't think that you can reconfigure the atoms in somebody's brain, So if they're not through birth sort of disposed to aspects of language, then it's probably going to be a struggle. But I believe that you can school people in poetic technique, and you can guide people towards poetic communities, and that you can show them things which simply don't work in poems and tell them why, and you can develop their critical vocabularies around poetry. And I think in that context, all you need is somebody who's really, really passionate about writing, but more than that, somebody who's passionate about reading. When my students come along at Leeds and previously at Oxford and previously at Sheffield, I've always said to them, I can only teach you one thing, really, and that, I can teach you lots of things, but the main point is that you can only be a writer if you are a reader. There's no shortcut, there's no way around that. It's impossible trying to try. And some of my students say to me sometimes, well, I don't want to read that person because I don't want to be influenced by them. So then they just end up being influenced by magazine articles or what it says on the bottle of pop, or pop song, or so if there is a way of making somebody who isn't a poet into a poet, it's usually through reading rather than through writing them, getting them to understand that they need to find 5 or 6 gods whose work they know almost inside out, and whose poems that they want to emulate and harmonize with in some way.
With over your 30 plus years of writing, how do you think your poetic voice has changed over that long span of time, or has it, I guess?
In one of my early poems, I quote a jogger who's running past the house, and I heard him say, it never gets any easier, just quicker. And I think maybe that's how my poems have changed. It's still a struggle, but I seem to be able to arrive at the place I want to get to a little bit more quickly. I think my perspective on life has changed. I think when I started writing, I was writing very much as a son and as a young man. I'm a father now, and that's, turned those perspectives. But I think it would take an outside eye to look at the poems and to make a judgment about how they've matured or gone the other way. I would hope they've changed. I mean, nobody wants to still be doing exactly the same thing that they were doing 30 years ago, and all poets are hungry to find new styles in their work, and that can be like a deliberate effort sometimes, trying to write in a different style. But yeah, I'm not really sure. You'd have to ask a dendrochronologist who could look at could cut into the rings in the poems and decide what the weather was 30 years ago.
There's been a kind of a mini explosion of poetry writing in some of these cities of India at least. But one is very uncertain about the quality. Now, novelists have editors who can tell them where they are going right and where they're going wrong. Where do poets go to get their work judged?
Yeah, there are similar anxieties in Britain, and a kind of quite a heated debate on occasions between what is sometimes described as page poetry and what is sometimes described as stage poetry. These arguments can get really overheated on occasions. And I think there's an idea that a lot of the stage poets are lacking editorship, and the page poets are still getting editorial input. My feeling is that, as I said before, poetry is a big thing. We've sort of got used to it being books and being written, and at the same time, a lot of the people who are performing their work, who think of themselves as revolutionary and radical, are actually traditionalists. They're doing what poetry did in the very first instances, in its beginnings. I just like to hope that in every aspect of poetry, people are hoping to achieve excellence, by which I mean put pressure on language. Occasionally students come into my office and I'll say to them, so they're right at the very beginning of their careers, and I'll say, why do you want to write? And they'll say, I've really got something to say. And I just think, oh no, we've all got something to say. If I get up and walk over there and pick up a bottle of water and come back over here, I've got something to say. The issue is, have you got an interest in language? Because that's the medium that you're going to be working with. And that's what I try and encourage in anybody, whether they're, as I say, spoken word artist or very literary poet, page poet. To me, that's the issue. How interested are you in language and its suppleness and its subtleties?
We have 2 more minutes, just one last one. Hi. So I'm glad that you brought up the fact of language and the inherent questioning of language that comes with writing poetry. I wanted to ask you how your relationship with language has changed over the course, and language and silences, because and as you said, poetry tends to emerge in times of conflict and war and revolution. And I feel like maybe it's in some ways people taking back language. So whenever a big change happens, you see a lot of poetry. So how has that been for you?
Well, I think in some ways you've answered your own question. You're sort of making a point which I recognise and I agree with. It's hard to know how your own language system has changed because you live in the echo chamber of your own idiolect. My guess is that for people who are 18, 19, 20 now, that there are phrases I use which sound old-fashioned, but it's a huge mistake for people who get into their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s to try and emulate the language of forthcoming generations and younger generations, because you just end up looking foolish. You just be trying, I think, just to try and be honest and work with the vocabulary that comes naturally to you. If you're enough of a listener and enough of a reader, then those changes in the lexicon will make themselves known to you, you know, and you will be on top of scientific language and so on and so forth. But it's euphemistic language that often catches older poets out when they try and use, you know, phrases and terms that don't sit comfortably. It's like this kind of the high-fiving dad.
On that note, thank you so much. We're all out of time. Simon's book is in the bookshop, so I would encourage you to buy. Thank you so much.
To both Simon Armitage and Nandini Nair for that wonderful session, Sandettie Light Vessel Automatic. To remind you, Simon will be signing books in the book signing tent out of the venue, out to the left towards Mughal tent, and we need to clear the room now for mandatory security checks. We would be really grateful for your cooperation with that. Thank you.